because presidential primaries are held sequentially, people are in the field and they don't have the results they wanted in Iowa and South Carolina and New Hampshire. Like you back in 2020. Like, you had a lot of people who were excited to vote for Andrew Yang, and they voted for you in California or Washington State or what have you, and you were no longer an active candidate, but they had already voted. We had actually 3 million votes that were cast for candidates who had dropped out by the time they were counted. And almost all of them were cast by someone who thought the person was still running, and then by the time they were counted, they no longer were. So early voting, which creates more access, also creates a lot more chance for basically lost votes. And so ranked choice voting would be just a very straightforward way to give those voters a backup, a second or third choice. So that's a really logical reason for it. It's also, these crowded fields are very common, and I think the idea of rewarding a candidate that brings people together is particularly valuable for presidential elections.
It is my pleasure to welcome the co-founder, president, and CEO of FairVote, Mr. Ranked Choice Voting himself, Rob Richie. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Andrew, and right back at you for all the leadership you've provided for the ranked choice voting cause over the last couple of years, so thank you.
It's awfully generous because you've been at this since way before RCV was cool, not to put pressure on you, but you co-founded FairVote 30 years ago, is that right?
Yep, 1992. And for people who are at least older than 35 or something, they may remember that was the year that Ross Perot ran for president, got 18% of the vote running as an independent, and really created a conversation about what that means in our political system. And we were working with a guy named John Anderson, who had run for president in 1980, and he had an op-ed in the New York Times in the first month of our existence saying it was time to change our presidential elections to ranked choice voting. So we've been at it for a long time.
Yeah, so 30 years ago, what the heck were you doing where you were like, okay, now I'm going to start this voting org?
Well, I wasn't in elementary school, but I was in my 20s, and I had been kind of a explorer of how I, as a young man, could have the impact I sought to have on what I felt was a lot of challenges for the United States and the world, particularly around ecological challenges. I actually had done a special issue of an environmental newsletter out in Washington State about the challenge of climate change way back in '91, and had kind of come to the idea of voting in politics as a way that, with changes, could galvanize government to actually be an ally for the changes that we needed. And that in turn led to a conversation and exploration of why it didn't do so now.
No way. You started out as a climate activist?
I was a climate activist before Al Gore,
it was cool.
but before he did his book Earth and the Balance. Yeah, no, and that was a real concern throughout my 20s. The ozone layer and tropical deforestation, and just like these issues about sort of like destruction of the underpinnings of the planet. I did my thesis in college about environmental ethics and about sort of what we can do about that. And so that was not political, but my wife, Cynthia, was involved in politics, sort of dragged me into politics, got me intrigued with what elections could be. And yeah, the idea of changing the electoral system, ranked choice voting, changing winner-take-all elections to some kind of proportional representation became like really exciting ideas for me. And I reached out pre-internet, writing letters and things to people, and connected with a core of people. And we ultimately came together and founded this effort in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1992.
So let's fast forward to today, because I feel like ranked choice voting and FairVote are enjoying a bit of a moment. People are figuring out, wait a minute, our voting system right now disproportionately empowers folks who may not actually have the best interests of the public at heart, or might not even represent, frankly, the mainstream of their community. So FairVote now is a multi-million-dollar organization. It has been instrumental in helping ranked choice voting achieve a ton of victories this past election day.
It has, and we have a lot of friends and allies helping us do it, which is new as well. So for like the first 25 years, we didn't only work on ranked choice voting. That was a centerpiece, along with changing to some kind of proportional representation. Those were like the two foundational pillars of our reform. But we worked on electoral college reform. We actually catalyzed the idea that we could have an automatic voter registration system. The idea like systemic solutions to voting problems was sort of the ethos. But we did have this work on ranked choice voting, and in the aughts, in like the 2000s, we had a string of really valuable city wins: San Francisco, Minneapolis, Pierce County, Washington. About 10, 15 cities voted and passed ranked choice voting, and we were in part of almost all of those. And then we had like a couple setbacks. There was sort of a stalling of the effort. And then in 2016, it passed in Maine statewide. It was a really exciting effort. There was a really strong local state group that did that. We were the main outside group to be helpful to it. That kind of just combined with, I think, the challenges to our democracy that we were experiencing, a lot of us were seeing, really triggered a whole new set of players coming in and groups getting involved. And we sort of begin to settle into a place where, different people are doing different things, I think really leaning into their strengths. So this year, Nevada passed ranked choice voting statewide, the same model that it was used in a really impactful way in Alaska that we can talk about. And that was one where we provided a certain kind of, policy expertise, but that was really driven by other people. And hats off to the state group that did that, to the Institute for Political Innovation that Catherine Gell runs, Unite America, Arnold Ventures, big investors in it, provide a lot of expertise. They raised a ton of money. They won a really groundbreaking win. We did a lot more with the city efforts. It was on the ballot in 9 cities, and it passed in 7 of them, cities and counties. And
wait, what were the 2 misses? Because I know. Wait, list the there 7 wins and then the 2 misses.
We got to focus on the misses. Yeah, there were a couple of counties in Washington State where a charter commission had recommended it. And I think what we feel in retrospect is the Charter Commission got a little ahead of the community, so it was like a good idea for that county, but there wasn't the infrastructure of support ready to kind of pivot into a campaign. So it did lose those 2 counties, but it won in Seattle, it won in Portland, Oregon, and won in the biggest county in Oregon called Multnomah. It won in a sprinkling of other cities: Fort Collins, Colorado, Evanston, Illinois, and all of them had like really good local campaigns that were associated usually with state groups that have emerged over the last 5-6 years. So we now have groups in more than 40 states. You've got valuable national players like a group called the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center that helps on election administration. And you've got my wife's group, Represent Women, which talks about what this means for women in representation. You've got groups like Unite America, Represent Us, and like different players doing valuable things. And so FairVote is, I think, a foundational group within that as a particularly valuable source of policy expertise, advocacy insights, and the ability to kind of like make sure that we're covering all the bases. So like if it's on the ballot in a bunch of cities, we're being attentive to trying to make sure that they're all getting the resources and support that they need. And that's, by the way, for anyone watching, it's not easy to just jump in and win ranked choice voting in a state. It's not super easy to do it in a city. It's possible, though. It's that Margaret Mead quote of just a handful of people can come together and identify an opportunity and nurture it, and actually can often create the conditions for a success. So we're hoping that we can go from about the 60 cities that are using RCV now to some version of 500 within 3 or 4 years, while we also make progress higher up. But that's something we all can be part of. Not every state can do it, but not every state allows their cities to do it, but a lot of them do, and it's something that's kind of an exciting way that people can explore getting involved.
So what Rob is saying is that if you aren't volunteering in your community to make ranked choice voting happen, there's an opportunity. You can do it. The holidays are generally a season of giving, but that shouldn't be the case when it comes to your internet privacy and data. Instead, give yourself the gift of ExpressVPN so that you aren't giving away your valuable data to internet service providers out there. We are passionate about your data being yours. I founded the Data Dividend Project to help make that happen. But the fact is, the big companies still have their run of the web. That's why I go online with ExpressVPN. It literally requires tapping one button to connect, and that's it. No matter what device I'm using, it then encrypts and reroutes all my network data through their secure servers, and you can be sure that your data isn't being logged by anyone. You've given enough to your ISP this year. It's time for you to start taking. So take back your internet privacy today with the VPN rated #1 by TechRadar and Mashable. Visit expressvpn.com/yang and get 3 extra months of ExpressVPN for free. That's expressvpn.com/yang. expressvpn.com/yang to learn more. There's a Rank the Vote or pro RCV organization, grassroots effort in a lot of different places. And they have, frankly, a winning argument just about everywhere they go. Because when people dig into it, it's like, wait, okay, my vote will be more representative of what I really think. There's no more spoiler effect. It encourages positive campaigning and discourages negative campaigning. It gets rid of runoffs, which they're very expensive and time consuming and energy consuming. I mean, we're seeing that in Georgia right now. So there are so many pros to it. It reduces polarization. It rewards reasonableness. And then the cons. What are the cons, Rob?
Yeah.
Since you spent all your time championing this.
Well, I think that ranked choice voting is an electoral change that's kind of like in your face, in a sense. Like some changes are sort of subterranean, like you change the voter registration system and, maybe it helps you get registered when you move into a state, but you don't really notice that as a big change, right? It just happens. And you can look at redistricting and the lines are drawn differently in a fairer way, and you might experience it being different, but sort of indirectly. Like it's not like you see the lines carved out on the landscape or something. Ranked choice voting, the ballot is different. Like you suddenly are doing something quite different. You're being able to rank, which by the way is quite empowering. You're no longer limited to just a single tick on the box, right? You're say, here's my first choice, and hey, I have a second choice. Here's my third choice. That's different, but it also is something you have to explain to people. And like, how are those rankings going to be used? Like, so there's like an educational issue, not how to rank, but what it means to rank, right? Like that's the biggest thing you need to work on. And the candidates, you ran for mayor in New York City in the system. The candidates themselves need to like learn how to do this and embrace it, or not feel they'd lost because of it, because they didn't know how to kind of run a good ranked choice voting campaign. Which, by the way, the secret
is really the shorthand is just try not to be an asshole, but continue.
That and just talk to more people and listen to them. Like that, exactly right. That's the big secret. But some people think it's they got the wrong thing. Then the results look different, right? So you get the results, you get a first choice count, and then no one wins a majority, and then you do the instant runoff to determine the winner, and the results look different. And say you're really invested in the outcome, and the results change because of the system. You're like, how did that happen, right? So there's a transitional demand with ranked choice voting, which once done, I think settles into a new reality that people are going to love and appreciate. And but there is a work you need to do during that transition time that I think is associated with what I guess could be said as downsides, which is you have to teach people new ways of voting and understanding results. But hey, that's in some ways just a better form of democracy. Takes some learning.
And it's very intuitive, Rob. I mean, one of the jokes I tell is that I've got 2 boys who are 10 and 7, and they can rank their favorites 1, 2, 3 pretty straightforwardly. And so when I was in Nevada, voters were getting text messages that frankly struck me as kind of scare tactics, where they're like, vote no on 3 because it's going to be too confusing and cumbersome. Right. like that's like the main argument.
It's confusing and cumbersome. And then also a transitional thing is we have a very inertia-oriented electoral sort of election equipment regime, right? So when so we have like here we are in the United States of America, like cutting-edge technology, all kinds of things that are really, moving us forward. And the way we actually count ballots on machines is sort of this stodgy, regulated, poorly administered. I mean, people are trying to do good work within it, but basically it's not very responsive to a change. So that when you bring in a new system like ranked choice voting, you have to come up with new processes that are straightforward technologically to do, and to do it very securely, very transparently, but you have to work within a regime like, say, the New York City Board of Elections, which doesn't handle it as well as they could if they were run in a different kind of way. And that's part of a challenge for us too.
So there was a snafu in the reporting of New York City, but let's get specific. So what proportion of these cities or districts that adopt ranked choice voting need new machines? Like, can their current machines actually read a ranked ballot?
Yeah, and that wasn't true for much of our history, right? So we would get the political cell. Like, people say, that's a great idea. Let's do this, right? And so way in the late 90s, we had statewide conversations going on in Alaska and New Mexico and Vermont, but their machines couldn't do it at that time. So then you say, it's a great idea. Oh, and the price tag's going to be you have to get new voting equipment, and that would sort of squash the interest. So then you just had to plow ahead, get your opening wins, get that inertia-bound regime to start changing. And now almost every voting equipment can do ranked choice voting in some form or another. Some can do it really well. So, like, say, Utah cities, 20 cities in Utah used ranked choice voting last year, and they all had election night ranked choice voting tallies, where you could see the status of the race. They still had to count some more ballots coming in, for the next day or two or three, but you already could see the first ranked choice voting tallies. They showed the results nicely, and that was with two of the biggest different voting equipment was used there. And it's just we're basically closing out that barrier very quickly. So we're at a point very soon where I think pretty much every community will be able to do ranked choice voting efficiently and well.
This holiday season, give your friends the gift of knowledge in the form of a book, specifically my book, specifically Forward, Notes on the Future of Our Democracy, which is really much better than it sounds. Really, really much better than it sounds. Thanks. Happy holidays. Get that book. The goal is to get to 500-ish cities over the next 3 years. I think
500 cities. We'd like 10 statewide uses of ranked choice voting.
Ooh, I like that.
And conversations in Congress. Those are our three big kind of advocacy-oriented goals, like serious conversations in Congress.
So you mentioned Alaska earlier. So Maine makes a change in 2016. Alaska makes a change in 2020, which means that this was the first cycle. And you saw very dramatic results where Mary Peltola beat Sarah Palin, in my mind, largely because of the nonpartisan primary and ranked choice voting process. Lisa Murkowski beats a Trump-endorsed challenger that, in my mind, was strictly because of the nonpartisan primary. If it had just been Republicans, Kelly Tshibaka defeats Lisa Murkowski, and then you have a Kelly Tshibaka, likely victory. But it sounds like it's had even more profound effects in terms of the way the state legislature is now organized.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Alaska is a really, in some ways, an ideal state to be modeling this form of ranked choice voting. It's majority independent. And while if you just look at the simplistic definition of how it votes for president, it's just a red state, it's like a independent state, right? So they had an independent elected as governor in 2014. They had a third-party governor in the 90s. They've had actually their legislative chambers for the last several years, at least one of the chambers has had a bipartisan coalition running it. So there's a history of the parties kind of figuring things out in a more independent way, and the voters reflect that, right? So that they're not simplistic, just one side or the other. And which is why someone like a Lisa Murkowski has been able to win there, even though she lost the Republican primary way back in 2010, and then she won as a write-in after
Crazy.
losing that.
Who the hell wins a write-in? Lisa Murkowski.
Spelling Murkowski, right. And so this year, the state Senate, which has 20 seats, this open primary system. So this form of ranked choice voting, everyone votes in the primary for one person, and they're all running together, right? So all the candidates appear before you. You vote for one, and the top 4 candidates advance. And that's when you use ranked choice voting in this final vote with 4 people, and you can put a write-in if you feel that none of those 4 people really are your top choice. And then, but then use ranked choice voting. So it's a much more kind of open process where the general election electorate, which is bigger, more full, they're making the final call. So of the 20 seats, 17 people, about equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans, have come together to form a governing coalition. So there's only 3 people, 3 Republicans, including the former Senate Majority Leader, who just didn't want to work across the aisle, who are off on one side. And basically these other 17 are going to carve out committees together, kind of work on a budget together, and have a supermajority to do things together. They will be certainly a firewall with any legislative effort that might be sparked to try to change the system. We now have a group of people that want to keep the current kind of electoral system. And really remarkable. The House is having similar conversations. It's more divided, so they may not have such a coalition, but they might. And it's fascinating to see what that means for governing, right? Because that's an expression of let's take the big hot button issues off the table. Let's work on things together that we all agree on. And there's some things that Alaska needs to do together, right? Because it's a state that has a lot of demands. It's a huge state, a rural state. A lot of things it needs to do well, and it now has a state senate at least, and the incentives for the other people in the system to try to work together to get things done.
People listening to this, imagine if the state reps in your state just got together and said, hey, 85% of us are going to form a governing coalition.
Right.
It'd be a very, very different animal.
Right. And the thing that's interesting, Andrew, is actually our committee structure historically, before we became as sort of hyper-partisan as we have, the committees themselves, like within Congress, function that way in a sense. So a committee would have Democrats and Republicans, an occasional independent, but basically Democrats and Republicans, and they would develop legislation getting input from both sides. Rarely did one side just jam something through, right? So there was you become expert in a committee, your expertise is respected, you have hearings, you develop legislation somewhat together, right? And so we actually have a history of that kind of cooperation kind of emerging, even within a structure that didn't actually have a formal coalition at the highest level. And we've gotten away from that. So legislation is much more likely to be developed just by one side, often just by leadership, and then you get all these floor votes where just one party votes for it and the other votes against it, and it's sort of like a different world than what we actually historically have had. So in some ways, what Alaska is doing is creating incentives to bring back a certain way of working together to get things done.
Oh yeah, man! It's like a freaking call back to some earlier woebegone, like long ago era where the parties weren't at each other's throats and people actually just sat down and were like, hey, well, what do you think would work? So you mentioned a goal of 10 states using ranked choice voting over the next several years. Right now we've got Maine, Alaska, Nevada just passed it, though they'll have to pass it again. I'm going to throw Arizona on the table because I was just there, and there are some folks in Arizona that are very eager to follow in Nevada's footsteps. What other states do you see as being on the potential, I'm not going to hold you to it, list to try and get to 10?
Well, here's the caveat to what I was saying. I think we get to 10 by not only winning sweeping victories. Basically, there are narrower victories that one can do. You obviously ran for president as a Democrat. You experienced a very crowded field in that Democratic field. 4 states that year, the party themselves, the Democratic Party, ran their own contests and used ranked choice voting ballots for that. That was Kansas, Alaska, Wyoming, and Hawaii. So those states did ranked choice voting contests. Now, Maine has now voted to pass ranked choice voting for presidential primaries. Maine does it for everything now, or all federal races, but that was a state legislative action to add it to presidential primaries. And so we'd like to see several more states move toward using ranked choice voting for presidential primaries as an important, logical, helpful way to use ranked choice voting, and that could be several states. And there's that conversation's happening in several of them. At the same time, you could have these Nevada, Alaska, exciting type ballot measures, and I won't name names actually, but There are, 2, 3, 4 states that people are looking at. But, we have a relatively small field of initiative states. So that's where, people can look on a map and see where the initiative states are, and at least there's a chance to have a conversation for that. And people are eyeballing what's possible right now.
Well, one state that's a legislative state where it's very much front and center now is Connecticut, because Governor Ned Lamont came out and said, I'm for ranked choice voting. And so now we're going to see what the bill looks like.
Exactly.
The Forward Party folks in Connecticut are trying to make sure, frankly, it passes.
Yeah, no, that was super exciting. And it's a way that third parties can really, create a conversation. And they certainly did in Connecticut, and I think it's an actionable follow-up to get some progress toward ranked choice voting. Now, whether it's all the way or whether it's just as a start for something like presidential primaries, we'll have to see. But that's, in some ways, getting a first step is actually huge, because you then get the state having it in place. So Maine used ranked choice voting at first for all primaries for state and congressional office, and then the general election for Congress, but it didn't use it for president. They had one use of it in 2018, and the legislature said, wow, that worked pretty well. And then they passed it for presidential elections, both general and, so once you get a proof of concept, you have a greater option and opportunity to take it to the next level.
Yeah, that's one reason I love having it pass in cities, because as soon as a city uses it, then it demystifies it. Everyone loves it. It's easy, and everyone's like, okay, especially if it's a big city in a state. And then when the state then is considering it, you've got, frankly, a lot of people who are just totally used to it and just say like, obviously we should be using ranked choice voting. So when you talk about a state adopting ranked choice voting in a presidential primary, is that state law, or is that something the party itself can adopt? Like, could the Democrats of Iowa just decide, hey, we're going to use RCV?
Right. Well, there's a handful of states where the party does its own contest, like Iowa. And of course, Iowa had a little bit of challenge back in 2020 under the DNC regime. And that's an example of a state that could look at ranked choice voting totally driven by the party. But that's only a handful of states. So most states, basically there's 43 states where it has to be done by state legislature, and then the party has to agree to use it. So there's kind of like a dance between party and state. And but I think if a state passes a law to set it up, the parties are likely to use it, because it really does. It's better for them. It's better. They get a better nominee. They make more votes count. I'll give a specific example of why it's catching on for presidential primaries. Is because presidential primaries are held sequentially. People are in the field and they don't have the results they wanted in Iowa and South Carolina and New Hampshire, like you back in 2020. Like, you had a lot of people who were excited to vote for Andrew Yang, and they voted for you in California or Washington State or what have you, and you were no longer an active candidate, but they had already voted. We had actually 3 million votes that were cast for candidates who had dropped out by the time they were counted, and almost all of them were cast by someone who thought the person was still running, and then by the time they were counted, they no longer were. So early voting, which creates more access, also creates a lot more chance for basically lost votes. And so ranked choice voting would be just a very straightforward way to give those voters a backup, a second or third choice. So that's a really logical reason for it. It's also, these crowded fields are very common, and I think the idea of rewarding a candidate that brings people together is particularly valuable for presidential elections.
Okay, here's the truth of it. I've been a mattress guy since my 20s. I just logically thought, well, if I'm going to spend up to 8 hours doing something, any money I spend on a good mattress is going to pay for itself many, many times over. And now the mattress that I sleep on is a Helix Sleep mattress, in large part because you can take a quiz and get a personalized mattress made for you, 14 different types, to your door and try it risk-free for 3 months and then send it back. I know, it seems almost too good to be true, but at this day and age, and this is something I definitely didn't have in my 20s, but why get a mattress that's made for everyone when you can get a mattress made right for you and yours? American made, 10 to 15 year warranty. This is the mattress of your dreams. Ha ha ha. And you can get it risk-free. Helix is offering up to $200 off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. With Helix, better sleep starts now. Give it a try. So it sounds like it's up for state law in most of these cases. You embarked on this journey 30 years ago thinking, hey, we should run presidential elections via ranked choice voting. What are the steps we would need to take? Because I've been saying for a while, we could be staring at a Trump-Biden rematch, and a lot of Americans would look up saying, like, hey, like, what are my other choices? And then the major counter-argument right now is like, oh, if anyone else runs, it's going to spoil it for one party or the other, Ralph Nader effect, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we need to do to actually make it so Americans could have multiple choices in a presidential election?
Well, so we talked about the presidential primaries. For the general election, currently, that's all done state by state. Right, so Maine now uses ranked choice voting for president. So in Maine, in 2020, people ranked candidates, and there was like a Green Party candidate, there was a Libertarian candidate, and Joe Biden actually got more than half the votes. So the ballot didn't need to kind of kick in to the second choices, but those people could vote for the Green and Libertarian and not worry about the quote unquote spoiler effect. So that's something that each state can do on its own, just using ranked choice voting within the state. There is fun ideas. In fact, I wrote a long article for the Harvard Law and Policy Journal about how you could combine state action on ranked choice voting with state action toward the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact Plan that is established as a way to effectively have states unite to create a national popular vote for president. And they actually could build ranked choice voting on top of that. And there's sort of laid that out. But that's a way that you effectively could actually have a state-driven process that allows states to be part of a national popular vote for president. If we ever want a truly united states of America election, we would need a constitutional amendment to kind of lock in that we'll have a national popular vote. And that would be the time to have a conversation about how to have the method of election for president as we change the Constitution. You can do it with the National Popular Vote Plan, sort of state by state, or you could sort of do a kind of this constitutional change, which is I don't think we're very close to doing, but that's where you theoretically could do it. One thing that's interesting when you look at all the presidential elections around the world, and a lot of countries have prime ministers who come out of the legislature, but there are a number of states, or countries rather, that vote directly for president. Pretty much all of them do require a majority, and most of them do a runoff election. But like, say, Ireland has ranked choice voting for president, and but that idea of upholding majority rule that you should get at least half the votes to become the chief executive is a general principle that's out there, and I think that conversation is an important one for us to have, and partly why we should have ranked choice voting state by state for governors as well, right? It's like we should make sure that the folks who are, in that important position of power have done the work necessary to earn majority support.
Yeah, who the heck wants someone who didn't get 50% of the vote? You know what I mean? Like, and I mean, that's one of the reasons why Maine adopted it, is that you had Governor LePage win without 50% of the vote, and they looked around and said, well, that's not cool.
Yeah, they'd had actually 3 consecutive governors, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and 1 independent. So conveniently, like, each side got a chance to win with less than 40%, right? So Wow. They were winning like 38, 36, or whatever. And at least one of those pretty definitively would not have won in a head-to-head contest. And that created a conversation. So it wasn't surprising that Maine was the first state to pass it.
So it sounds like for the presidential, you have this constitutional amendment approach for a national election, or just you get a bunch of states on board. So it's already in effect in Maine. And so if you had enough states adopt it, and certainly I'm very, very excited about the state-by-state approach. One thing I do want to get into for a minute is how the heck Connecticut's governor wound up endorsing ranked choice voting. So I tell jokes about this, Rob. I said, like, did he just wake up and say, oh, this is a good idea? Of course not. I mean, that's not the way political figures make these sorts of decisions. He made the decision because he wanted to win his race against a Republican, and they realized that there was a ballot line called the Griebel-Frank for Connecticut line that their consultant said was worth about 3% in the general election, whoever was endorsed by the Griebel-Frank party. And so how the heck did the Griebel-Frank party get that ballot line in Connecticut? Because they ran for governor in 2018 and got 4% of the vote, which is above a threshold to get this ballot line. Now, Connecticut is a fusion voting state, which means that you can have another party have its line. But the same kind of political calculation could apply in any state where it became a winning issue, where if you knew that you were going to get even 2 or 3% of voters to vote for you because you endorsed ranked choice voting. In Connecticut, both the Democratic and the Republican candidates for governor wound up endorsing it because they were just trying to win. So one of the things that Connecticut demonstrates is that if you have a political interest in being for these reforms, then it can become a winning issue.
Yeah, no, it was really intriguing and exciting, and I think shows the value of having priorities, essentially, right? And the leverage that comes with that, right? So that if any group of people can prioritize an issue such that they can say, we are going to prioritize this and our votes are going to reflect it, if it's a good idea or a reasonable idea, you can find people to listen to, because they are, even though we don't have ranked choice voting, like Governor Lamont was in essentially functionally a head-to-head race, and needed to figure out how to win a majority, and he needed to kind of get up to over 50%, and then where you start saying, hey, I'm only 4%, but I'm part of your 50%. You should listen to what I care about, and that's sort of part of what a good elected official, a good candidate needs to always be doing, right? Is like essentially thinking of these voters as they have a myriad of interests, but I'm willing to kind of be a coalitional candidate, bringing them together. And that's what politics really often is, and it's okay to be that way. And I think the Connecticut example is just a really clear dramatization of that.
All right, Rob, so here's an idea where we do it nationwide. Check it out. The 2020 presidential election gets decided by maybe 70,000 votes in 4 states, and the 2024 race will probably be similar. So the 4 swing states that everyone knows are going to be very, very close are Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. Those things are probably going to be within 1%. And then if you were to expand it a little bit to 2%, you end up including Pennsylvania and Michigan.
Right.
So
which is not very many, by the way.
It shows how messed up our system is. 44
states,
you're baked. 6 states, maybe might swing one direction or another. So they have all the power and the political ads. They can look forward to that. But let's imagine that you got a coalition of, let's say 500,000 independents or swing voters in those 6 states to say we are going to back whichever presidential candidate comes out for nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. And maybe let's throw it in there, the Fair Representation Act, which you and I can talk about. Yeah. You could get this fulcrum, because our country is so polarized and our system is so dumb, honestly, you could make it a winning issue in the 2024 presidential race between the 2 major parties. Call it 5 and 6, which stands for 5% in 6 swing states. What do you think?
I think that is a potent concept. You just have to find, if you can find those, if you can find the voters, if you can find 5%, probably even 3%, but hey, 5% is all the better, who agree to prioritize that. And it's really challenging for a lot of people, because they can say, well, I really love these issues, but I care about something else that's associated with that party, their views on abortion rights or climate change or, economic issues of a certain kind, right? Like you have to essentially say, I'm going to make those secondary. I'm going to vote based on these priorities, because if we can make this change, it'll make a change in our politics that'll allow me to be able to do forever after much more of what I want about all the other things that I care about. So if you can persuade people to do that, it would be very powerful, right? It would be a foolish candidate who essentially said, no, as particularly, I think those issues are good issues. Like obviously, I'm biased, but I think those issues are ones that voters would appreciate a candidate being for, right? It is a kind of a voters first agenda, right? Which is like that candidate is standing up for voters, doing the right thing, and these 5% of people are now going to vote for them. Which, if you do the math, if they're not all from one side, right? If they sort of like include some people who might vote Republican and some people who might vote
Let's say
Democrat,
half and half, even ideally.
that would be the powerful thing, right? If you truly have a certain set of swing people, that would mean that whoever makes that position, if only one of them does, is getting this boost, which, given the way our politics is, that's a huge boost. Yeah, very powerful.
So Asian Americans are 9.1% of the electorate in Nevada, 4.4% in Georgia. So those are two states, 3% in the other states. And they tend to be a very pragmatic group, so non-ideological as well. So I think you could make this happen. And I may be spending a significant amount of time and energy making this happen.
Yeah, no,
but 5 and 6.
Yeah, no, 5 and 6. That's 5 and 6 and 24. Yeah, yeah. The math we'll have to work that out. It could be 4 and 6 and 24, and then it would all be like a sort of like a product.
Oh my gosh, you're right. Because the fact is, you're right that 5% isn't even necessary. I mean, these margins are so
4%.
Close.
If it's evenly divided, that does it. Like if you get 2% Republican leaning, 2% Democratic leaning, that's enough.
So right now, people are looking around saying, okay, our democracy is not functioning so well. Congress has a satisfaction rate of 22% last I checked. But you have these single-member districts, and that even if you were to open it up via ranked choice voting, the fact is a lot of the time you'd still wind up with a Democrat or Republican winning. But there is a way to a more actually representative system, and it's a bill sitting in Congress right now. It's called the Fair Representation Act, and Rob and FairVote have been all for it.
Yeah, no, it is a truly exciting idea. Statutory, just an act of Congress, but it is something that Congress has the right to do under the Constitution. They have control of time, place, and manner of congressional elections. And interestingly, over in the early part of the American history, states had at-large elections for Congress. Number of them. They were allowed to under the Constitution, and they said, well, let's not have single-member districts, let's just run statewide. As the parties took shape, particularly in the 1830s, that began to mean one party would just win all the seats, right? Because it was like New Jersey or something would have a statewide election, and one party would have a few more votes than the other, but the voters would just vote them all in. And so it became understood kind of as an unfair approach to have these sort of at-large elections. So back in the 1840s, Congress, using its constitutional powers, mandated single-member districts. So you had to have one person per district. And interestingly, that was just at the time when the very first books literally were coming out to say, hey, there's different ways of having elections. You can use different approaches. And there's a kind of a whole family of systems that are generally called proportional representation. But it's sort of a loose term that describes basically something where one side doesn't win all. There's some way for more of us to have access to representation. And there's a whole range of ways to do it. As other countries, just in the latter part of the 1800s, were sort of starting to establish their systems, they were aware of this thinking and different models, and almost all of them actually didn't use winner-take-all single-member districts. They used some kind of system which wasn't one side winning all. Because when you think about what a representative legislature should be, sort of like antithetical to representation to have a whole lot of people not get representation. And we have had a conversation at the city level. There are actually a number of communities in the United States that don't use winner-take-all elections. And there are these systems. There's a system called cumulative voting, which is used in a bunch of Texas cities and a few ones in Alabama and so on. There's others. There's this one that's based on ranked choice voting. Actually just passed on the ballot in Portland, Oregon. So Portland, Oregon is now moving to this system and will use it in 2024. And in the Portland system, rather than having one person represent each neighborhood, they'll have sort of somewhat bigger districts, and they'll have 3 people. So you have more than one representative, But it's not winner take all, so that you rank the candidates like a typical ranked choice ballot, and then your goal is to use that ranked choice ballot to have as many people as possible help elect someone. The math of it works out that about 3/4 of people can reliably elect their favorite candidate or one of their favorite candidates in every such election. And you apply that math to Congress. So if we could do this at a congressional level, so Congress is the power, and a Fair Representation Act would be an expression of how to do this. Establishing districts of like 3 or 4, maybe up to 5 seats. That's the current way that the bill is set up. You would rank the candidates just like you do in Alaska and Maine, but the tally would be adjusted to basically try to have as many people as possible help elect someone. And you would have no part of the country where there's at least 3 representatives where likely one party would win all the seats. So you go to like the bluest of blues, like, New York City, or the reddest of reds in, rural Texas or something, and you would have both parties having the electoral.
It would just be 2 or
electoral.
3 Dems and 1 Republican, or vice versa.
Exactly, some degree of openness, and the Dems and Republicans would have differences within them. But furthermore, if you're an independent or a third party candidate, you're never a spoiler, right? You put your best foot forward, and now you no longer need 50% to win. You can get in with maybe 20%, 25%, so that you can make your best case. You can try to win with that percentage, and if you don't win, your second choices matter, and they all know that, right? And all the candidates have to be nimble and building coalitions, and so it just would mean that you'd have an elected body that has shared representation, shared interests in actually serving their constituents together. When they retreat to their party caucuses, the whole country stays in the room. And it's just a different way of doing politics that is within statutory reach. And that's, if we could add that to our mix, I think we would do so much for Congress. And by the way, create a whole pool of candidates who could run for Senate having better reflected the spectrum and often run statewide. Yeah.
Our current system is so underrepresentative when, essentially, if you're in a red state, let's call it Missouri for fun. Missouri is still probably, has like millions of Democrats. They're just nowhere to be found in the officials. They said to Washington. So the Fair Representation Act would allow for actual representation. And it would allow for different perspectives and probably some minor parties to break through. So you'd have some group of members of Congress who aren't D or R, which, by the way, would be a godsend in this political climate because, that would be a lot of what Americans want. I think one of the supplements to this is that we have too few members of Congress relative to the population. Where I think there was something like 80,000 Americans per representative, when they started, and then now that number is up to 900,000 or something ridiculous.
And we used to change the size of the House every 10 years, without exception. Then in 1910, they didn't do it. They couldn't come to an agreement. So then we went 20 years with the same number, and then they just said, okay, let's just keep that number. So that was like 100 years ago, over 100 years ago. Our population has tripled since then. So every district is now 3 times bigger than it used to be. So we definitely are ripe for a conversation about adding members, and they do go very well together.
The Fair Representation Act, last I checked, had maybe half a dozen co-sponsors or something along those lines. And everyone who's behind the Fair Representation Act is awesome. Because if you're behind it, then, you're enlightened.
And there's some great folks, and I think it's a latent issue that I think will grow in support as we have more of a conversation about it. And this is a way that people can definitely help by just giving a heads up to their member about this idea. So whenever they're like saying, oh, I'm just so frustrated with gerrymandering, which they have every right to be frustrated with gerrymandering, this is like a comprehensive, universal fix, right? For everyone.
Right. You just made a super district, then you can't really draw in any funky way.
Exactly.
That you
the
do
voters
with
are in charge everywhere, right? It's just a whole different thing.
Yeah, the Fair Representation Act is the closest thing to a silver bullet, and most people don't understand it. Well, I tried to explain it to my wife the other day, and she got it. She's very smart, but it took me a little while. It was my fault, not Evelyn's.
We'll work with you on the tools how to talk about it, because it is so exciting, but it is something we need to get down to, a bumper sticker that I guess is more than the name, but we have to be able to sort of say, yeah, you rank the candidates and it's bigger districts, and like it's and it's like it's a representation like it's a pie, and you sort of cut the slices, and whatever. We'll work on our.
You and I will workshop it together. I genuinely do think that all of this energy and momentum is now gathering around you, Rob, and FairVote. Hope you feel good. You've been working on this for literally decades. What are you most excited about upcoming, and how can people help?
Exciting one, as I said earlier, it's now not just FairVote, right? So there are all kinds of ways to get involved and great allies to work with, and I really like the way we're working together with you and the people involved in the Forward Party, and who are really doing a great job talking about this issue, and groups like Rank the Vote and these state groups that are emerging almost everywhere. If you go to FairVote Action, of which you are a board member,
yes, board member of FairVote Action, proudly.
Go to get involved, and you'll see links to both national groups and state groups, and we really are trying to channel people as much as possible into state groups, and ideally then those state groups are creating their own momentum that will include supporting the chances that we're trying to galvanize around congressional action and state action. Of course, people can, and we hope will, support FairVote directly and FairVote Action, and sign up, and we'll create opportunities for you to help out with things. But there really is a nice spectrum. Like, for instance, if you're a college student, for instance, there are now up to, I think we're very close to 100 colleges and universities where they have gone through a formal process to change their student body elections to ranked choice voting.
Great.
It's so cool. And a lot of uses of the Fair Representation Act approach. We've got maybe 15 to 20 that do the proportional system as well. And that's been very organic, very and impactful, for these student elections. You'll have 10, 15,000 people vote in some of the bigger universities that use this system. Your NGO, there's something called, go to rankit.vote, and you can sort of set up your own contest with ranked choice voting. So anyway, lots of things to do. Certainly learning about it and helping us figure out the best way to talk about the Fair Representation Act and so on. But it is something that, for my excitement level, I would say going to this election, you always feel nervous. It was on the ballot in 10 places, and some of those races seemed really close. A lot of money was being spent against us in Portland, Oregon, say. And it just, didn't win all of them, but we won most of them. And almost every city campaign has won for 5 years now. We're up to some version of 23 out of 25 cities or something that have voted on it. So it's not a slam dunk, but you have to, pick your targets. But it definitely can.
The voters like it, Rob. As soon as you get it, when I was in Nevada too, I'm so pumped that Nevada, because both parties came out against it, and I was there when the Dems were, in my opinion, just trying to scare people. It was messed up. But the will of the people won out. And when people use ranked choice voting, they love it. You've been helping make it possible for millions of Americans. You are one of the unsung heroes of American democracy. And if we make it through this period, Rob Richie's going to be a big reason why. FairVote Action, check them out. Again, imagine getting into this stuff in 1992. And look at where we are now. You've done incredible work, my friend.
Thank you, Andrew, and I greatly appreciate that. I'm so excited about where we are and what we all can do together. 4 and 6 and 24.
4 and 6 and 24. Let's go.